On the 12th of May 1944, hundreds of American heavy bombers crossed into German-controlled Europe and turned toward a target that did not look, at first glance, like the center of the war. It was not a beachhead. It was not a capital. It was not a famous battlefield where infantrymen had carved their names into history. It was a sprawling industrial complex near Merseburg, Germany, Leuna, one of the great synthetic fuel plants of the Third Reich. Beneath the bombers were pipes, tanks, cracking units, rail lines, smoke screens, anti-aircraft guns, and one of the most important secrets of modern war: tanks do not move on courage, aircraft do not fly on ideology, and armies do not advance on speeches. They move on fuel. By the spring of 1944, Nazi Germany still had factories. It still had engineers. It still had armored formations, submarines, jet aircraft projects, and young men being rushed into Luftwaffe cockpits. On paper, parts of the war machine still looked dangerous, but behind the steel was a weakness that could not be hidden under camouflage nets or moved into a bunker. Germany's war had become a war of engines, and the engines were beginning to starve. This is the story of the forgotten oil war, the campaign that did not always appear on the front page, but reached into every cockpit, every tank park, every convoy route, every training school, and every last gamble of Hitler's collapsing Reich. It was not the only reason Germany lost the Second World War. The Eastern Front, Allied industry, strategic bombing, naval blockade, resistance movements, code breaking, manpower losses, and brutal battlefield attrition all mattered. But fuel was the invisible battlefield under all of them. Without fuel, a Panzer division became a collection of steel boxes. Without aviation gasoline, a fighter force became a museum of parked aircraft. Without lubricants, even the best machinery began to die from the inside. And before we go deeper into this overlooked campaign, leave a like, subscribe to Declassified War Stories, and turn on notifications if you want more stories where the real turning points were hidden in files, factories, maps, and decisions most people never heard about. To understand why oil mattered so much, we have to go back before the bombers reached Leuna, before Normandy, before the Ardennes, and even before the first American air crews saw the smoke over Ploiești. Germany entered the war with a serious petroleum problem. The Reich had coal, steel, chemists, and industry, but it did not have the kind of domestic oil supply needed to sustain a long, mechanized war against the world's industrial powers. Blitzkrieg made Germany look fast and modern, but speed consumed fuel at a terrifying rate. Every armored thrust, every Luftwaffe sortie, every U-boat patrol, every truck column, every recovery vehicle, every training flight demanded petroleum products that Germany could not easily replace. The Nazis tried to solve this problem in several ways. They imported oil from partners in occupied territories. They looked toward Romania, especially Ploiești, as a vital source. They pursued the oil fields of the Caucasus in the east. And they leaned heavily on synthetic fuel, using coal and chemical processes to produce gasoline and aviation fuel. German chemistry was advanced, and synthetic fuel helped keep the war machine alive far longer than geography alone should have allowed. But that solution created a new vulnerability. Synthetic fuel plants were massive, complicated industrial targets. They could be defended, repaired, hidden in smoke, and surrounded by flak. But they could not simply vanish. In 1942, the German drive toward the Caucasus revealed how deeply oil shaped strategy. Stalingrad is remembered as a city of ruins, snipers, frozen soldiers, and catastrophic encirclement. But the wider German campaign in the south had oil behind it. The dream was to break the Soviet Union and reach the great oil resources beyond the mountains. The German army never achieved that objective. When the Sixth Army was destroyed at Stalingrad, the dream of solving Germany's oil problem by conquest began to collapse with it. From that point forward, Germany was forced to fight an industrial war while standing on an increasingly fragile fuel base. The Allies understood the importance of oil early, but understanding a target and destroying it were not the same thing. In the first years of the air war, Allied bombers faced limited range, heavy losses, weather, accuracy problems, and a German fighter force that still had teeth. Air leaders debated target priorities: aircraft factories, submarine yards, ball bearings, transportation networks, cities, and oil. Some raids could be dramatic without becoming decisive. Others damaged facilities but lacked the follow-up needed to keep them down. Germany's repair organizations were skilled, disciplined, and desperate. A refinery hit once could be patched, rerouted, and brought back into production. The most famous early strike against Axis oil came on the 1st of August 1943, Operation Tidal Wave, the low-level American B-24 raid against Ploiești in Romania. The target was critical, the mission was daring, the cost was terrible. Flying from Libya, the bombers crossed roughly 1,000 miles to hit oil facilities that fed the Axis war machine. But the formation was disrupted by clouds and navigation problems. The attack lost much of its intended surprise. Over Ploiești, the bombers came in low through smoke, fire, cables, flak, and enemy fighters. For the crews, it was a mission through hell at chimney height. The images became legendary: liberators skimming over refineries, black smoke rising from shattered installations, aircraft clawing their way out of a burning industrial maze. But the hard truth of Ploiești was more complicated than legend. The raid damaged the facilities, but production was restored quickly enough that the blow did not permanently cripple the Axis fuel supply. The courage of the air crews was beyond question. The strategic result was limited by the lack of sustained follow-up. Ploiești proved both the importance of oil and the difficulty of killing an oil system with one dramatic strike. That lesson mattered. By 1944, the Allies had something they did not fully possess in 1943. More bombers, better escort fighters, improved intelligence, aerial photography, and increasing air superiority. The Luftwaffe was still dangerous, but it was being ground down by a brutal battle of attrition. American long-range fighters could now escort bombers deeper into German airspace. Allied planners could photograph damage, watch repairs, and strike again when plants were close to coming back online. The oil campaign began to change from isolated raids into a system of pressure. That is where Leuna comes back into the story. On their 12. Mai 1944, the 8th Air Force attacked synthetic oil targets including Merseburg, Leuna, Zwickau, Brooks, Lütgendorf, Berlin, Zeitz, and Chemnitz. This was not just another bombing mission. It marked the beginning of a more systematic assault on the fuel structure that held German mobility together. Leuna was huge, heavily defended, and extremely important. It was protected by smoke screens and dense anti-aircraft defenses. For bomber crews, missions against targets like Leuna became some of the most feared assignments of the European air war. The logic was simple, but the execution was brutal. If Germany repaired a plant, the Allies would come back. If production resumed, it would be hit again. If smoke concealed one aim point, more bombers would return under worse conditions. It was a grinding, repeated campaign against pipes, tanks, compressors, hydrogenation units, rail links, and repair crews. The war over oil was not won in one spectacular raid. It was won by making recovery temporary and destruction recurring. This is the part of the war that is easy to miss in popular memory. A tank destroyed in combat is visible. A city captured appears on a map. A surrender can be filmed. But a training program quietly cut because there is not enough aviation, gasoline is harder to dramatize. A Panzer unit delayed because fuel stocks cannot reach the front does not always produce a famous photograph. A fighter pilot sent into combat with fewer hours than his Allied opponent does not look like an oil target, but he is one of its consequences. By the summer of 1944, the effects were spreading. Allied attacks on synthetic fuel plants and oil facilities reduced German coal production at a catastrophic pace. Petroleum, oil, and lubricants were not just one commodity. They were the bloodstream of mechanized war. Aviation, gasoline affected pilot training and combat readiness. Motor fuel affected Panzer divisions, trucks, recovery vehicles, and supply columns. Lubricants affected engines, transmissions, aircraft maintenance, and factories. Nitrogen and chemical byproducts connected the oil system to munitions, agriculture, and synthetic rubber. The deeper the Allies struck, the more the consequences multiplied. For the Luftwaffe, the timing could not have been worse. German aircraft production had not simply vanished. In some areas, the Germans were still producing large numbers of aircraft. But aircraft without trained pilots and fuel were not enough. Experienced German pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. New pilots needed hours in the air, and hours in the air required fuel. As the fuel shortage deepened, training was cut further. The result was a deadly spiral. Inexperienced pilots entered combat, suffered losses, and forced the Luftwaffe to send more replacements with less preparation. The Allies were not only shooting down planes, they were attacking the system that created competent pilots. On the ground, the German army faced the same invisible pressure. A Panzer division was not just tanks. It was fuel trucks, maintenance crews, ammunition carriers, recovery vehicles, radios, engineers, and supply routes. When fuel became scarce, commanders had to decide which vehicles moved and which stayed behind. Training was reduced. Counterattacks became harder to mount. Tactical opportunities could appear and disappear because the gasoline was not there. A tank that cannot reach the battlefield is not a weapon. It is a burden. The Allies were also attacking transportation, and this made the oil crisis worse. A ton of fuel sitting in the wrong place was almost as useless as fuel never produced. Bombed rail yards, damaged bridges, destroyed locomotives, and disrupted roads made distribution more difficult. Germany's problem was no longer only producing fuel, it was moving it under constant air attack while the fronts were closing from east and west. The more the system shrank, the more fragile it became. Then came one of the clearest examples of Germany's fuel desperation, the Ardennes offensive in December 1944, remembered in America as the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's last great offensive in the West depended on speed, surprise, and captured Allied fuel. German armored columns were supposed to break through, cross the Meuse, and drive toward Antwerp. But the plan rested on assumptions that the German logistical system could barely support. The offensive consumed precious reserves and depended in part on seizing the enemy's supplies. When the attack failed to achieve its objectives, the fuel it burned could not be replaced. That is the devastating reality of late-war Germany. The Wehrmacht could still produce moments of shock. It could still launch attacks. It could still kill. It could still force American, British, Canadian, Soviet, and other Allied soldiers to pay for every mile. But the strategic foundation beneath it was collapsing. A mechanized army running out of fuel can still be dangerous in bursts, but it loses the ability to choose. Maneuver, train, recover, and sustain. It becomes reactive. It becomes brittle. It fights harder in smaller spaces because it can no longer move freely across larger ones. The oil war also reveals something important about American power in World War II. Victory was not only courage on beaches or heroism in foxholes, though there was plenty of both. It was also intelligence analysis, photographic interpretation, engineering, logistics, aircraft production, escort fighters, aircrew endurance, fuel science, and the ability to return again and again to the same target until the enemy's repair effort could no longer keep up. It was an industrial democracy learning how to find the pressure points of an industrial dictatorship. There is a moral weight to this story as well. Strategic bombing was costly, controversial, and often inaccurate. Many airmen died, many civilians died. Bombs did not always hit what planners wanted them to hit. The oil campaign should not be presented as clean or simple. War from the air was never clean, but the evidence shows that the sustained attack on Germany's oil system had severe military consequences. It reduced fuel production, curtailed pilot training, hampered armored movement, and helped accelerate the operational collapse of the German war machine. The forgotten oil war did not replace Normandy, Stalingrad, Kursk, the Atlantic convoys, the Italian campaign, the Soviet offensives, or the work of resistance and intelligence networks. It connected them. Every front demanded movement. Every movement demanded fuel. When the fuel system broke, every front felt it. By 1945, the Third Reich still had weapons. It still had men under arms. It still had leaders issuing orders from bunkers and headquarters. But the machine those orders depended on was failing. Aircraft sat idle. Training was shortened. Engines were conserved. Tanks were abandoned or immobilized. Counterattacks lost reach. The German army could still fight, but it could no longer fight as the fast, mechanized force that had terrified Europe in 1939 and 1940. That is why the oil war deserves to be remembered. Not because it was the only battle that mattered, but because it reminds us what modern war really is. It is not only flags, speeches, uniforms, and famous generals. It is fuel and storage tanks, rail cars at night, refinery pipes, repair crews, aerial photographs, bomb damage assessments, and the quiet arithmetic of whether an army can move tomorrow. In the end, Hitler's war machine was not just smashed from the outside, it was starved from within. The Allies found the bloodstream of mechanized war and cut it again and again until the machine still looked alive in places, but could no longer move with purpose. The forgotten oil war was not glamorous, it was not clean, it was not won in a single headline, but it helped turn German strength into stranded steel. If this story helped you see the war from a different angle, leave a like, subscribe to Declassified War Stories, and turn on notifications, because some of the most important battles were never told on the front page.